Welcome to Sleep with Secrets, where bedtime gets darker and secrets never sleep. If you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, because some stories disappear before they're ever heard again. And tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? I'd like to know where the secrets are spreading. Now get comfortable and let's get started. Long before the headlines, before the courtroom, before the bathtub and the questions, there was just Ryan Widmer and Sarah Stewart, two people in their 20s trying to build a life. Ryan grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, on the west side. He had a twin brother named Aaron and an older brother too. From early on, Ryan was known for being quiet, gentle, and drawn to sports. He wasn't aggressive, not even when joking around with his cousins. If anything, he was the kind of kid who didn't like confrontation even in play. In 1990, when Ryan was just 9 years old, his world changed. His parents divorced. Though the family had tried to hold things together for years, it had become too difficult. After the split, Ryan and his brothers lived with their mother, Jill, full time. They saw their father, Gary, on weekends, but even that arrangement brought tension. Ryan's mother had a strong presence, and the boys had naturally gravitated toward her. Their father, although heartbroken, respected their loyalty. Eventually, in 2001, just a year after Ryan graduated high school, he and his brothers made a decision. They stopped speaking to their mother. Whatever the reasons, the choice was painful but final. Gary, their father, stepped in fully. He honored their wishes, even though the family ties had been stretched thin. Ryan's high school years were defined by baseball. He had talent, enough to earn a partial scholarship to Miami University. Not the Miami in Florida, but the one in Oxford, Ohio, a quiet college town known for its beautiful campus and solid academics. Although he didn't start at the main campus, Ryan worked hard at a nearby satellite campus in Hamilton for 2 years. He kept up his grades and played well on the baseball team. Eventually, he earned a spot at the main campus and completed his degree in sports studies. After graduation, things began to fall into place. Ryan landed a job working in operations for one of the oldest tennis tournaments in the country. It was the kind of opportunity that could lead to something bigger, and it did. Soon, he was hired at the Warren County Convention and Visitors Bureau, doing exactly what he had studied for. He planned and marketed sporting events. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real work, and Ryan was proud of it. Still, something was missing. His coworkers liked him. They thought he was kind, loyal. But many of them noticed that Ryan didn't seem particularly social outside work. He wasn't dating anyone. He went home to a grandmother who was terminally ill. He was devoted to her, taking his lunch breaks to visit, helping care for her, sitting by her side in her final days. He was a good man, they thought, but maybe he needed someone. One of Ryan's old college roommates thought the same. So, he set up a double date, himself, his girlfriend Ryan, and his girlfriend's coworker Sarah Stewart. Sarah was different from Ryan. She had grown up in a small town just north of Cincinnati, in a modest one-story house that her father had built by hand. It was 1,300 square feet, tight, simple, and full of memories. She had siblings. She had roots. She had a laugh, high-pitched and impossible to miss. Sarah was 3 years younger than Ryan, born in 1984. She had been athletic in high school, playing volleyball, softball, soccer, and even joining the cheerleading squad. Friends described her as beautiful and strong-willed. She had a type A personality, organized, assertive, and in control of any room she walked into. And she loved teeth. From her first dental cleaning, Sarah knew she wanted to work in dental hygiene. It was an odd dream to some, but not to her. After high school, she entered the dental hygiene program at Raymond Walters College, and after graduating in 2006, landed a job at a dentist's office just across the Ohio border in Fort Thomas, Kentucky. When Ryan and Sarah met on that double date, something clicked. They were different, yes, but the kind of different that worked. Sarah was fiery. Ryan was calm. She took charge. He let things flow. He liked her confidence. She liked how grounded he was. A second date came quickly, then another, and soon they were inseparable. Their relationship moved fast, maybe too fast, some said, but for them, it felt natural. Sarah's family loved Ryan. His gentleness balanced Sarah's more commanding energy. And Ryan, he adored Sarah. He would do anything for her. Friends saw it, family noticed it. Even when they joked and teased each other, the affection between them was clear. But life didn't slow down for them. Just months into their relationship, Sarah's father was diagnosed with malignant melanoma. It was devastating. Ryan stepped in, quietly, gently, just as he had done for his grandmother. He was there for Sarah every step of the way. He didn't run. He didn't pull away. He stayed. And then, barely 4 months after they started dating, they bought a house together. A 4-bedroom home in Hopewell Valley, a quiet suburb in Hamilton Township, Ohio. It was ambitious, bold, maybe reckless. But they had plans, marriage, a family. Ryan had always said he wanted to start a family before he turned 30. And Sarah, at just 23, was willing to move quickly with him. Their house was bright and clean, nestled in a suburban subdivision with trimmed lawns and wide driveways. It was a 45-minute drive from Sarah's job and a long haul for Ryan too, but they made it work. They were proud of the life they were building. Ryan, always traditional in some ways, asked Sarah's mother for permission to propose. She said yes, though she had quiet concerns. Sarah made more money than Ryan, and she wasn't sure how that would play out. Still, she approved. Ryan had inherited money from his grandmother after her passing. She had told him not to waste it, so he used it to buy Sarah's engagement ring, a 1-carat princess-cut solitaire. Simple, elegant, just like her. He planned the proposal carefully. Their French bulldog, CJ, had grown to be Sarah's favorite. So one day after Sarah got out of the shower, CJ came bounding up the stairs toward her with the ring tied to his collar. Ryan was waiting at the bathroom door, down on one knee. She said yes. It should have been the beginning of forever. But just a few months after that moment, after the ring, the laughter, the promises made in the steam of their bathroom, Sarah would be gone. On August 11th, 2008, everything changed. Sarah came home from work with a headache. She had migraines often, and one of her favorite ways to ease them was to soak in the bathtub. Her brother later said she used to do her homework in the tub as a teenager. Baths were her thing. It was normal. That night, Ryan said he stayed downstairs watching a preseason football game between the Cincinnati Bengals and the Green Bay Packers. Sarah went up to soak in their large oval-shaped tub. It was just a quiet Monday night, but 40 minutes later, Ryan went upstairs and found Sarah, face down, not breathing. When Ryan saw Sarah, he froze. She was lying face down in the water, motionless, half submerged. The same tub where he had proposed just months earlier, now still and quiet. Panic set in fast. Ryan called 911. His voice shook. He tried to explain what he was seeing, but his words were broken and rushed. He told the dispatcher that his wife had fallen asleep in the tub, that she wasn't breathing, that he needed help, fast. The 911 call lasted 4 minutes. In it, Ryan struggled to remain calm. He cried. He stumbled through explanations. He said the water was draining. He said he had tried CPR, but later admitted she was still in the tub. There were pauses, uncertainty. At one point, it sounded like he was blowing into the phone, rather than into her lungs. Later, there was a different sound, like CPR being performed further away from the receiver. To some listeners, Ryan sounded confused, grieving. To others, he sounded rehearsed, distant, possibly even pretending. He said Sarah must have fallen asleep. It was the first thing he told the dispatcher, and it became one of the first things investigators questioned. How could someone fall asleep in the tub? Wouldn't they wake up if they slipped underwater? And then there was the water. When first responders arrived, just 6 minutes after Ryan's call, something seemed wrong. Sarah's body was out of the tub by then, lying on the floor. Her skin was dry. The bathroom rug beneath her was dry. The tiles weren't slick, but her hair was wet. The room didn't look like someone had just drowned in it. Not to the paramedics, not to the responding officers. It looked dry, too dry. Still, the paramedics did everything they could. They performed CPR. They attempted to intubate her, again and again. 5 times they tried to get a tube into her airway. They tried to insert IVs into her arms, but couldn't find a vein. Eventually, they had to place one in her neck. A blue strap was wrapped around her throat to hold it all in place. Sarah was rushed to Bethesda Arrow Springs Hospital. Ryan followed behind in the front seat of the ambulance, clutching his phone. His hands shook. He sobbed quietly. He tried to reach his mother, then Sarah's mother, then his father. At the hospital, doctors joined the effort to revive her. But 45 minutes after she had been found in the tub, there was no heartbeat, no breathing. Sarah Whittemer was pronounced dead at 11:41 p.m. A nurse walked into the waiting room and told Ryan and his mother the news. Ryan dropped to his knees and cried. Loud, heavy sobs echoed through the quiet hospital halls. He had only been married for 4 months. Just like that, Sarah was gone. After the declaration of death, things moved quickly, maybe too quickly. The coroner's investigator arrived. His job was to gather facts, interview witnesses, and collect anything that might become evidence. Ryan was asked to explain what happened. He described how he had been watching the Bengals game downstairs, and how Sarah had gone up to take a bath for her headache. She'd done it before, nothing unusual, until he went up and found her that way. Ryan answered questions for 20 minutes. Then he signed a consent form allowing the coroner's team and police to enter their home and begin a search. He didn't hesitate. He never thought, even for a second, that he would become a suspect. He was focused on loss, not guilt. He left the hospital with his mother and returned to their house in Hopewell Valley, just long enough to gather a few things. He said he couldn't stay there. Not that night, not in that bathroom. He'd sleep at his mother's house. His mother went inside the house alone. Ryan waited in the car. Upstairs, she picked up some clothes from his bedroom. On the dresser, she saw Sarah's wedding rings, carefully placed, as if Sarah had taken them off before stepping into the bath. His mother gathered them and decided to bring them to her son. But as she passed the master bedroom, something caught her eye. The carpet. There were small squares of fabric missing, cut clean out. One by the foot of the bed, one by the far wall. She paused. Why would they do that? She said nothing, just walked back to the car, where her son was crying silently and holding Sarah's rings. Later that night, Ryan sat in his mother's living room, surrounded by family, his aunt, his uncle, all of them in shock. They stayed up until 5 a.m. talking about Sarah, her smile, her laugh, how fast it had all happened, how none of it made sense. By morning, police had already begun to look closer. Sarah's death, they said, seemed suspicious. The paramedics had noted how dry the bathroom was, how her body was dry, how the rug was dry, how her hair was still damp, but nothing else suggested she had just been pulled from a full tub. The coroner's investigator had flagged it, and soon after, the coroner delivered his ruling. Homicide. According to the report, Sarah had injuries that didn't line up with a simple accident. Bruises, small cuts, deep hemorrhaging in the soft tissues of her neck. Injuries, the coroner said, that were not consistent with CPR attempts. Injuries that suggested pressure, struggle, contact. And so suspicion turned to accusation. Police never called Ryan in for an official interview. Instead, they issued a warrant. He was arrested for the murder of his wife. The charge was later upgraded to aggravated murder, a charge that suggested intent, that Ryan had planned it, or at the very least, had time to stop himself and didn't. It was a stunning development. Ryan was stunned too. He had just started planning Sarah's funeral. He had chosen cremation, thinking of what she might have wanted. He had told the funeral director that they needed to preserve her body for a second autopsy, just to be safe. His lawyer had suggested it, but before the arrangements could be finalized, the news broke. The coroner had ruled it a homicide. The prosecutor made a public statement, standing at a podium in front of news cameras, stating that Sarah's death was not an accident, that there had been signs, injuries, enough to warrant a murder charge. The headlines followed fast. Husband arrested after wife found dead in bathtub. Bathwater murder? 4 months after I do, tragedy strikes. The media had its angle, and Ryan, once the quiet sports lover from Cincinnati, became a name in a different kind of story. He turned himself in, and the town of Hamilton Township, once so quiet, so ordinary, watched as one of their own was taken into custody. From that point on, nothing would be the same. From the outside, the Widmer house looked untouched, a clean 4-bedroom home in a quiet Ohio neighborhood. But inside, things had already changed. The bathroom where Sarah was found had become a scene of suspicion. The first thing the coroner's investigator noted was the dryness. There was no visible water on the bathroom floor, no damp towels nearby. The rug beneath Sarah's body had been dry, no puddles, no footprints, but Sarah's hair had been wet, her body mostly dry. That detail became the focus. The bathtub itself was oval-shaped, the kind found in newer homes, large and built for soaking. Not one you'd expect someone to accidentally turn over in. Investigators questioned how Sarah could have ended up face down in such a space. Even if she had fallen asleep, wouldn't the tight curve of the tub have kept her more or less in place? Ryan's story wasn't changing. He had been downstairs watching football. Sarah had gone upstairs for a bath to help her migraine. She'd done that before, but the problem wasn't just the story, it was the evidence left behind, or the lack of it. Ryan had said that Sarah was still in the tub when he began CPR, but he also said the tub was draining, and then later drained. If he had performed CPR while she was in the tub, how had that worked? A person needs to be on a flat surface for proper chest compressions. A tub wouldn't allow that. The dispatcher had told him to move her from the tub, but Ryan had already said he performed CPR. Which was it? Then there were the long pauses during the 911 call, moments of silence. Some people said it was just shock. Others thought he was waiting, deliberately calculating. It didn't help that the 911 operator handling the call wasn't following protocol. At one point, the dispatcher asked if Ryan was Sarah's mother. It was confusing. He also told Ryan to drain the tub, something he wasn't supposed to do. That step may have compromised the crime scene, because once that water disappeared, so did any evidence it may have held. The call center director later resigned, not because of Ryan, but because the dispatcher had never been properly trained. That part wasn't his fault, but it would play a role in how the case unfolded. Once Sarah's body was removed from the home, investigators got to work. Photographs were taken, samples collected, parts of the carpet were cut out. 2 squares, one near where Sarah's head had rested, another by her pelvis. Both pieces had faint stains. Those stains would become central to the case. Back at the hospital, the coroner examined Sarah's body. There were no major wounds, no broken bones, but there were subtle signs, small bruises, light abrasions, faint marks. She had bruising on the right side of her forehead, petechiae, tiny broken blood vessels, on the inside of her eyelid, a bruise on her neck, a minor contusion on the back of her scalp, a small scrape beneath her arm, and faint cuts inside her upper lip. Inside her body, the injuries were harder to see, but deeper. There was hemorrhaging in the muscles of her neck, bruising beneath the scalp, a small tear in her liver, but none of it appeared obviously fatal. The medical examiner reviewed the findings and reached a conclusion. Sarah's death had not been accidental. The injuries, though small, were significant, and the lack of water on her body and the floor made it harder to believe she had simply slipped under. There was no alcohol in her system, no drugs, only a little caffeine. To the coroner, the evidence pointed to only one conclusion: homicide. But not everyone agreed. Ryan's lawyer, after seeing the charges, immediately arranged for a second autopsy. He hired Dr. Werner Spitz, a well-known forensic pathologist who had testified in high-profile cases like the JFK assassination and the O.J. Simpson trial. Spitz reviewed the same evidence. His conclusion was different. Yes, Sarah had injuries, but he believed they could have come from the 45 minutes of CPR attempts, the aggressive intubation, the failed IVs, the strap around her neck that secured the breathing tube. The bruising, he argued, might have been caused not by violence but by emergency procedures. He saw no indication that Sarah had been intentionally harmed. He ruled the cause of death as undetermined. That ruling alone would become crucial, because in court, if there's any reasonable doubt, a murder conviction can't stand. But by that point, public opinion had already taken shape. The prosecutor stood in front of news cameras and said this was no accident. Sarah's injuries were not caused by CPR, she insisted. There had been trauma, and Ryan's story didn't line up. It was, she said, a textbook case of hidden violence. The press called Ryan the bathtub killer, and that was all many people needed to hear. As investigators went deeper, they searched for a motive. Was Ryan having an affair? No. Had the couple been fighting? There were no reports of domestic violence. Did Sarah have life insurance? She had filed paperwork for a policy through her employer, but it hadn't taken effect yet. Ryan knew that. There was no financial gain in her death. The search went further. Phone records, text messages, emails, nothing. No secrets, no evidence of a plan, no clear motive. But there were the inconsistencies. The TV downstairs, Ryan said he had been watching football, but when police checked, the TV was turned off, and the channel it had been left on wasn't showing the game. The bedroom TV, however, had been tuned to the correct channel. So was Ryan watching from upstairs? Or was he lying? To some, these were small details. To others, they mattered. If he was lying about where he was, what else might he be hiding? Then there was the bathtub itself. It had been mostly dry. Only a few droplets around the drain. No splash marks, no overflow. No signs that a full tub had recently been emptied. And the carpet squares collected from under Sarah's body? They arrived soaked through. The paper bags holding them were damp. So some moisture had been there. But how much? Sarah's sleep habits became another piece of the puzzle. Ryan had told the dispatcher that he thought she fell asleep. But was that possible? Friends and family said Sarah often fell asleep at odd times, in public during events, even in the middle of conversations. One friend even called her the sleeper at a baby shower as a joke. Sarah's own family said it had always been that way. Ryan had begged her to see a doctor. She finally went in June, just 2 months before her death, but when she came home, she told Ryan the doctor said she was fine, that some people were just more tired than others. It's unclear if she actually mentioned the sleep problem during that appointment. Later, her medical records showed she hadn't. Did she forget? Was she embarrassed? Or did she simply think it wasn't worth mentioning? We may never know. But to Ryan, it became something to hold on to, a reason, an explanation. If Sarah had fallen asleep, maybe it had been a freak accident, a moment of fatigue that ended in tragedy. To the prosecution, it sounded like an excuse, a way to soften the story, a way to steer investigators off course. And so every little detail became evidence, every inconsistency, a reason for doubt. And for those who believed Ryan was guilty, this was enough. Still, others saw it differently. They asked, where's the evidence? No fingerprints, no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no marks on Ryan. Sarah's manicure and pedicure were untouched, not even a chip. Her fingernails were natural, painted in a French style. If she had fought, Wouldn't there have been scratches? Broken nails? If Ryan had forced her underwater, where were the bruises? Where were the signs? The only physical injuries were the ones that could be explained by CPR, but not everyone agreed on what CPR would cause. Even experts argued, and the more the arguments continued, the more divided the story became. Some believed Ryan was guilty, others believed he was being wrongly accused, and Sarah's death, sudden, silent, unexplained, remained in the middle of it all. When the state of Ohio formally charged Ryan Widmer with the aggravated murder of his wife Sarah, the community was stunned. Just 4 months earlier, the couple had been celebrating their wedding. Now, Ryan was being accused of ending her life. His legal team moved quickly. They understood the weight of the charge. Aggravated murder meant the possibility of life in prison. It was a serious allegation with serious consequences. But more than that, it was deeply personal. Ryan had never been arrested before. He had no history of violence. He was not someone who fit the profile of a killer. Still, the prosecution pushed forward. Their case was simple in presentation. Sarah had died from being forcibly drowned, and Ryan was the only other person in the house that night. The evidence, they argued, supported that theory. The dry bathroom, the autopsy findings, the inconsistencies in Ryan's statements, and, most of all, the lack of any other explanation. But the defense had its own narrative. They pointed out that there was no direct evidence of foul play, no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds, no motive, no witnesses, and multiple expert opinions had disagreed on the cause of death. This, they argued, was not a clear-cut case of murder. It was a tragedy, one the state was trying to explain by forcing a conclusion. The trial began in March 2009. It would be the first of 3. The courtroom filled quickly each day. Family members, reporters, members of the public, all of them watching closely. Some had made up their minds. Others came seeking answers. At the prosecution's table sat Assistant Prosecutor Michelle Snodgrass and her team. They laid out their case piece by piece. First came the 911 call. Jurors heard Ryan's voice, shaky and anxious, telling the dispatcher that his wife had fallen asleep in the tub. They listened for tone, for gaps, for hesitation. Then came the responders. Paramedics and firefighters took the stand. Each described the scene they walked into that night. The dry floor, the dry rug, the condition of Sarah's body. They spoke about the attempts to revive her, the medical efforts at the hospital, the signs that raised their suspicion. The prosecution called on Dr. Russell Updegrove, the coroner who performed Sarah's autopsy. He testified that the injuries on Sarah's neck, scalp, and lip indicated force. He said the deep muscle bruising couldn't be explained by CPR alone. He ruled her death a homicide, specifically drowning by force. Updegrove was firm, confident. Then came the evidence collected from the house. The carpet samples, the measurements of the tub, the layout of the bathroom, and then Ryan's statements. Detectives testified that Ryan's timeline had small inconsistencies, that his CPR story didn't match protocol, that the draining tub raised questions, that he seemed calm, maybe too calm, in the hours after Sarah's death. It all added up, they argued, to something more than coincidence. It added up to guilt. The defense responded. They called their own expert witnesses, including Dr. Werner Spitz, the pathologist who had reviewed Sarah's autopsy. He strongly disagreed with the homicide ruling. In his view, the injuries found on Sarah were common in aggressive medical intervention. The bruising, the internal bleeding, the torn lip, each could be explained by the repeated attempts to save her life. Spitz was respected in his field. He had testified in nationally known cases. His words carried weight. Then came character witnesses. Ryan's friends and coworkers described him as kind, quiet, respectful, not someone who lost his temper, not someone who would harm the woman he loved. They also brought attention to Sarah's sleep habits, her friends, her family. They testified about her tendency to fall asleep quickly, sometimes in odd places. They said she dozed off during car rides, while watching TV, even at parties. Her mother said it had always been like that. The defense argued that if Sarah had a hidden sleep disorder, it could explain the tragedy. A sudden loss of consciousness in the bath, an accidental drowning, no foul play, just a tragic event. But the prosecution pushed back hard. They emphasized the physical evidence, the dry scene, the bruises, the timing. They reminded the jury that Sarah had never been formally diagnosed with a sleep condition, that her visit to the doctor hadn't included any mention of excessive fatigue, and that no one had ever seen her fall asleep in the bathtub before. They asked, "What are the chances?" Closing arguments came after days of testimony. The prosecution painted a picture of a marriage that wasn't as perfect as it seemed. They didn't need a motive, they said, to prove a crime. The evidence spoke for itself. The defense called the case weak, built on speculation, lacking proof. They asked the jury not to guess, not to convict based on uncertainty. After deliberating for about 23 hours over 2 days, the jury returned guilty. Ryan Widmer was convicted of murdering his wife. He sat silently as the verdict was read. No visible reaction. His family behind him was stunned. His father, pale and expressionless. His mother, shaken. Sarah's family remained quiet. They had not spoken publicly throughout the trial. They still didn't. But the case was not over. Not long after the verdict, a problem emerged. One of the jurors had admitted to conducting their own research during the trial, an act strictly prohibited. Specifically, the juror had looked up information online about how long it takes a person to drown. That action violated the court's instructions and threatened the fairness of the entire process. Ryan's legal team filed for a mistrial. The judge agreed. The conviction was thrown out. Ryan would face a new trial. In January 2010, nearly a year after the first trial, Ryan stood before a new jury. This time, both sides adjusted their approach. The prosecution added more expert testimony, trying to solidify their argument. The defense leaned further into the idea of reasonable doubt, highlighting the lack of direct evidence. This jury deliberated for several days, and they couldn't agree. A mistrial was declared. A third trial began in April 2011. By this time, public interest had grown. National media had covered the case. Ryan's story was featured on news programs, drawing opinions from people far outside Ohio. The third jury heard much of the same evidence. But this time, the state presented something new. Testimony from a biomechanics expert. He argued that Sarah's body position and the size of the tub made it unlikely she had drowned accidentally. The defense countered with another pathologist, who again maintained that the injuries could have come from life-saving efforts. After deliberating, the third jury returned a verdict. Guilty, again. Ryan was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. His legal team filed appeals, but each was denied. And with that, the case was closed, at least in the eyes of the court. Ryan was transferred to prison. His family continued to maintain his innocence. Sarah's family remained silent, and a quiet suburban neighborhood was left with a lasting memory of a young couple, a bathtub, and a death that no one could ever fully explain. When the courtroom doors finally closed behind him, Ryan Widmer was no longer a newlywed, a grieving husband, or the quiet neighbor next door. He was a convicted man, sentenced to a life shaped by walls, silence, and routine. The transition from freedom to incarceration was swift. He was processed and transported to the Correctional Reception Center in Orient, Ohio. The prison was cold and gray, its walls high and lined with barbed wire. Here, new inmates were classified, evaluated medically, psychologically, and behaviorally to determine where they would serve their time. For Ryan, the reality of prison life settled in quickly. There were no familiar faces, no soft voices, no freedom to step outside when the air felt tight. He had gone from home ownership to a 6x9 cell with a metal bed frame and a scratchy blanket. The lights were never truly off. the noise never truly gone. Keys clanking, voices echoing, doors slamming. Yet, in the middle of all this, he still maintained his innocence. He filed appeals, each one a formal request to review what had happened. His lawyers argued that the evidence had been misinterpreted, that the expert testimony in the third trial had lacked foundation, that the case was still built on theories, not proof. But appeal after appeal was denied. The court stood by the conviction. They believed the evidence had been fairly presented, that the jurors had made their decision based on what they saw and heard, that the law had done its part. So Ryan waited. He read books. He wrote letters. He made phone calls when he could. In some of those calls, he spoke with reporters, always careful, always repeating the same thing, that he didn't do it, that Sarah's death had been a terrible accident. He still called her name sometimes in his sleep. Back outside the prison walls, the Widmer and Stewart families lived with the same silence, just in different forms. Ryan's parents stood firmly behind their son. They believed in him, supported him, defended him publicly. His mother had once worked for the county health department. His father had been a businessman. Now, much of their life revolved around appeals, interviews, and quiet endurance. They believed Sarah's death had been a tragic, unexplainable event. Nothing more. Sarah's family, however, never gave interviews, not once. They chose silence. No television cameras, no public statements, no courtroom outbursts, only presence. They were there at each trial, seated behind the prosecutors, quiet and still. Their silence carried its own weight. To many, it looked like strength. To others, like sorrow too deep to express. But one thing was clear. They had lost a daughter, and nothing would bring her back. Public interest in the case lingered for years. News outlets revisited it during anniversaries. Crime shows explored its details. The narrative shifted depending on who was telling it. Some saw Ryan as a man wrongly accused, caught in a storm of circumstantial evidence. They pointed to the lack of motive, the absence of a clear cause of death, and the conflicting expert testimony. Others saw him as a guilty man who had simply outsmarted the system long enough to make people question the obvious. To some, he was a victim. To others, a killer. In the years that followed, questions continued to surface. Why was the bathroom dry? Could Sarah really have fallen asleep in the tub? Could medical responders have caused the bruises? Why were there no defensive injuries? What was the exact time of death? No matter how many times the case was reviewed, no clear answer came. The physical evidence remained open to interpretation. The timeline, just believable enough to raise doubt, just shaky enough to raise suspicion, and the one person who could answer all the questions was gone. For those closest to the couple, the pain never fully left. Ryan's friends tried to stay in touch, but the weight of the case was hard to ignore. Some drifted away, others stayed in contact, writing letters or visiting occasionally. Sarah's friends held on to memories. They described her as bright, easy to laugh, deeply loyal. They couldn't imagine her life ending the way it did. But they had no more information than anyone else. They only knew what had been presented in court and what had been left unsaid. Time moved slowly inside prison walls. Ryan became another name on a long list of inmates. He wasn't treated differently. He didn't cause problems. But the years blurred together, one after the other. Every so often, a new appeal would surface, bringing a flicker of hope, a possibility, a chance, but each one was denied. In interviews, Ryan remained composed, not defiant, but steady. He continued to say the same thing, that Sarah had fallen asleep, that he had found her, that he had tried to save her, that it had all happened so fast. And yet, for many, something about the story still didn't make sense. Why hadn't he noticed she was in trouble? Why didn't he mention checking on her? Why were there so many inconsistencies? But no one could answer those questions. Only Sarah could have filled in the missing pieces, and she never had the chance. Outside, the neighborhood changed. The Widmer home was eventually sold. New families moved in. New voices echoed through the halls. The tub remained. So did the memories, at least in the minds of those who remembered what had happened there. But for the most part, life went on. People moved, children grew. The media turned to other stories. Yet every now and then, someone would mention it. The case, the bathtub, the husband, the verdicts. And each time the story would come back to the same place. Not certainty, but silence. As time moved forward, the Widmer case remained under quiet scrutiny, not just in courtrooms or newsrooms, but in the quiet spaces where science and doubt often meet. At the heart of Ryan's defense was a single word: reasonable. Reasonable doubt, reasonable explanations, reasonable uncertainty. And in that space, where medicine met interpretation, were two opposing camps of experts, both staring at the same evidence and arriving at two very different conclusions. Sarah's autopsy had raised more questions than it answered. To one coroner, Dr. Russell Updegrove, the signs were clear. Petechial hemorrhages in the eye, bruising in the neck muscles, contusions on the scalp, abrasions to the lip. He said these weren't random or mild. They were patterns, indicators, signals of pressure, of struggle, of forced submersion. In his opinion, this wasn't accidental. This was homicide. But the defense brought in Dr. Werner Spitz. He had seen countless autopsies, worked on some of the nation's most high-profile forensic cases, and to him, the very same injuries suggested something else entirely. Spitz argued that Sarah's body had undergone prolonged and aggressive attempts to revive her. The bruises on her neck, that could be from IV placement, the blood in her eye. That could come from lack of oxygen during CPR. The abrasion inside her lip. That might have happened when emergency responders tried intubation repeatedly and unsuccessfully. To Spitz, the evidence was not consistent with homicide. It was consistent with resuscitation. Two doctors, two conclusions, each standing behind their findings, each holding fast to the science they believed in. The jury had to choose which one to believe. But even outside the courtroom, the medical world debated the case. Other pathologists reviewed the autopsy. Some agreed with Updegrove, others with Spitz, and some stood in the middle, unable to take a side. The question lingered. Can bruising alone prove murder? There had been no water in Sarah's lungs, no fluid in the stomach, nothing that screamed drowning in the classic medical sense. But drowning rarely left obvious marks. That's what made it complicated. And in the Widmer case, the complications only deepened. There was also the matter of the bathroom itself. The prosecution emphasized how dry everything had been. The floor, the rug, even Sarah's skin. How could someone have been pulled from a full bathtub, they asked, without making a mess? Photos taken at the scene showed a neat bathroom. Nothing looked disturbed. No water stains, no towels tossed about, no clothes soaked from lifting her out. But the defense had a counter. The paramedics said her hair had been wet, and the paper bags holding the carpet squares arrived damp. That meant some water had been there. Still, it didn't explain why the floor and rug were dry, unless Ryan had moved her long after the water drained. That's what the prosecution suggested, that he delayed the call to 911, that he staged the scene, but the 911 call was only 4 minutes long, and responders arrived within 6 minutes of that call. If he had delayed, it would have been minutes, not hours. And if he had planned to make the scene look like an accident, why wouldn't he have left the floor wet? Why not leave water everywhere? These were the kinds of questions that never found clear answers. Another layer of confusion came from the 911 dispatcher's instructions. He had told Ryan to drain the tub. That step, whether right or wrong, likely eliminated a key piece of evidence. Because once the water was gone, so were any signs of struggle, any traces of DNA, any clues at all. And the dispatcher himself wasn't certified. He had never completed formal training. When questioned later, the head of the 911 center resigned, admitting that they had fallen short of protocol. That admission didn't change what had happened, but it raised doubts about the reliability of that night's communication. Could a better trained dispatcher have gotten more information from Ryan? Could different instructions have preserved the scene better? We'll never know. The Widmer defense also brought attention to Sarah's sleep behavior. Friends and family described it as unusual. She'd fall asleep quickly, often without warning. She dozed off during movies, conversations, even in the middle of social events. Ryan told them that Sarah would sometimes fall asleep in the car within minutes. One friend recalled Sarah sleeping upright at a baby shower. Another described her drifting off mid-sentence at work. They had laughed about it then, called her the sleeper, a joke that now felt chilling. Had Sarah simply fallen asleep in the bath? If so, it could explain everything. The defense argued this point again and again, that if Sarah had a medical issue, narcolepsy, undiagnosed sleep apnea, or any form of hypersomnia, she could have slipped under without realizing it. But there was no diagnosis in her medical records, no formal sleep study, no medical report confirming she had a disorder. She had gone to the doctor just weeks before her death, but she hadn't mentioned her sleep issues. She told Ryan afterward that the doctor said she was fine. That moment, whether it was a misunderstanding or a missed opportunity, hung over the case like a shadow. Because had she been evaluated, perhaps a clearer picture would have emerged, but she wasn't, and the absence of that diagnosis left the courtroom divided. Then came the experts in biomechanics. At the third trial, prosecutors brought in a specialist to analyze the tub, its shape, slope, and Sarah's size. He testified that it would have been extremely unlikely for Sarah to slide into a face-down drowning position without effort, especially in that kind of tub. Its curved backrest and central drain made passive slipping nearly impossible. According to him, her positioning raised questions. It didn't match accidental drowning scenarios he had studied. The defense, however, argued that biomechanics is not an exact science, that his analysis was theoretical, not conclusive, that no one could say with certainty how a person behaves during unconsciousness in a bathtub. Even the expert admitted there was no perfect model for what had happened. It was opinion. Technical, educated opinion, but still opinion. And opinion wasn't proof. With all this back and forth, science clashing with science, memory clashing with evidence, the public remained split. Supporters of Ryan pointed to the reasonable doubt. No motive, no confession, no witnesses, no past violence, no financial gain. Supporters of the prosecution pointed to the inconsistencies, the unexplained injuries, the dryness, and the timeline that just didn't sit right. And both sides stood firm. Years passed. Appeals came and went, each one revisiting the same points, each one ending the same way. Denied. And through it all, the one truth everyone agreed on was that Sarah had died young, just 24 years old, a newlywed, a daughter, a friend, gone in the silence of a suburban bathroom. The arguments, the science, the legal strategies, all of it added up to one thing: uncertainty. And in true crime, uncertainty is both a question and a verdict. It haunts, it lingers, it invites opinions but offers no peace. Because in the Widmer case, justice came down not to what was known, but to what couldn't be proven. Once the courtroom doors closed for the final time, and the final appeal had been denied, Ryan Widmer began the slow passage of years within the prison system. Each day became a measured routine: morning roll call, meals at strict intervals, brief phone calls, and long stretches of silence. Prison life was never meant to be comfortable. But for Ryan, it wasn't just the physical isolation. It was the emotional weight, the constant replaying of events, the unanswered questions, the years ticking by in slow motion. Yet, in the outside world, a handful of people never let go. His parents visited regularly. They attended every hearing, stood before every camera, and repeated the same message: that their son was innocent. They believed with absolute conviction that what happened to Sarah was a tragic accident, that the legal system had filled in gaps with assumptions, that Ryan was being punished not for what he did, but for what couldn't be explained. His mother in particular carried much of the public burden. She gave interviews. She sat quietly behind Ryan at trials. She responded to reporters. And all the while, She remained steady in her stance, that Ryan's version of events had never changed, that he had told the truth from the start. Ryan's father, less public but equally present, supported from behind the scenes. Together they became the foundation of Ryan's world. His close friends also remained, though fewer in number. Some reached out through letters, others visited when they could. But as the years passed, many moved on, caught in the current of their own lives: weddings, children, new jobs, new homes. Ryan stayed behind. Inside, the days blurred together. He read books. He watched the clock. He wrote letters to friends and family. He participated in programs when allowed. But for the most part, life behind bars was uneventful, predictable. The noise of the outside world faded until something brought it rushing back. Occasionally, a news article would surface, reigniting public conversation. A documentary, a podcast, a mention on a true crime show. Each time the old debates returned. Was Ryan guilty? Or had he been convicted based on uncertainty? In one interview years later, a juror from the first trial admitted that the photos of Sarah's body had swayed them. The bruises, the medical testimony, the dryness of the bathroom. It was a combination of things, they said. Not a single piece of damning proof. But was that enough? Ryan's supporters didn't think so. They argued that convictions should be based on fact, not suspicion. That a life sentence shouldn't come from theories. That no one had ever proven Ryan's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Yet he remained in prison all the same. Sarah's family, on the other hand, remained quiet. They had endured 3 separate trials. They had listened to every piece of testimony. They had watched Ryan walk in and out of courtrooms for years. They never spoke publicly, not in interviews, not to the media, not during sentencing, but they were always present, always watching. For them, silence may have been a choice, or a shield, or a kind of mourning no words could ever touch. They had lost Sarah, and the only person ever held responsible was now behind bars. Whether or not that brought peace, no one could say. As the years went on, even the prison system forgot the name. Ryan Widmer became just another inmate, one of many. His case no longer headline news. His cell number more familiar than his own voice. He adjusted, but he never confessed, never altered his story, never wavered in his claim that Sarah had fallen asleep in the tub, that he had tried to save her, that everything happened in the space of a few minutes, and that it was too late by the time he noticed something was wrong. There were no new developments, no new witnesses, no new evidence, only time. For those on the outside who still questioned the outcome, it remained a troubling case. Some believed the state had made a mistake, had chosen to prosecute instead of investigate further. Others believed justice had been done, that the injuries, the dry scene, and the inconsistencies in Ryan's account told a story too difficult to ignore. But the truth, as always, stayed buried beneath opinion. Even after all the hearings, all the testimonies, all the appeals, the central question had never been answered. What really happened to Sarah Widmer that night? Ryan's case would eventually be included in law school discussions, in true crime debates, in forums about forensic science. His name became less personal, more procedural. But for his parents, it was never about headlines. It was about their son. And for Sarah's parents, it was never about the courtroom. It was about their daughter. 2 families, 1 death, no closure, only a legal decision, only time and silence, and the weight of what would never be known for sure. After the final verdict, the courtroom cleared out one last time. The reporters packed their equipment. The prosecutors gathered their its files. The defense team, weary from years of arguments and motions, folded up their notes, and Ryan Widmer was led away in handcuffs. For many, the case was over, but the echo of that verdict did not fade easily. In the quiet that followed, the story continued, just in softer voices, in quieter places, in the corners of minds that couldn't let it go. Because no matter what the jury had decided, the questions still lingered. Those who had followed the case closely, people in the community, legal observers, even some former jurors, found themselves returning to the same moments: the 911 call, the dry bathroom floor, the medical testimony, the injuries, the sleep discussions, the emotional courtroom scenes. The images were hard to forget: a young bride gone without warning, a young husband, now a convicted man, a home that had once been filled with wedding gifts and future plans, now remembered only for what happened in the bathroom. It was a story that stirred both sympathy and suspicion, and neither side ever fully convinced the other. Even among those who accepted the verdict, many admitted it hadn't come easily, because what happened that night still wasn't crystal clear. It had been a case built not on fingerprints or eyewitnesses, but on medical interpretation and perception. And perception can change even when verdicts do not. Legal experts continue to discuss the Widmer case in lectures and articles. Some use it as an example of why forensic science needs clearer standards. Others examined how much weight juries place on autopsy photos and expert testimony. There were discussions about the 911 dispatcher's role, about the emergency response protocol, about whether Ryan's inconsistent statements were nerves, trauma, or something else. The case became a kind of mirror, reflecting whatever people already believed about guilt and innocence, justice and doubt. And no matter how much time passed, those reflections never completely faded. In prison, Ryan remained consistent in his words. He did not give interviews often, but when he did, his story never changed. He said Sarah had fallen asleep in the bathtub, that he had found her face down, that he had pulled her out and tried to save her, that he had drained the water only after being told to by the dispatcher, that none of it made sense, that the moment everything happened, it was already too late. He repeated those words not because they changed, but because they hadn't. Over time, the press moved on. The headlines stopped, but Ryan's name still appeared in legal journals, in internet threads, in true crime documentaries. Each time, people re-examined the case, looking for something new, a detail overlooked, a piece of testimony misunderstood. But the facts remained the same, and the silence of Sarah's death still said more than the pages ever could. Ryan's prison sentence was 15 years to life. That meant parole was possible, but not guaranteed. His legal team continued exploring options, new strategies, new reviews. But each one came with limits. The appeals had been exhausted. The evidence had already been tested and argued in court 3 separate times. The legal road, for now, had reached its end. Outside, the world moved on. Neighbors who had once shared driveways and small talk rarely mentioned the case anymore. New families had moved in. New stories took root. But for those who had lived through the trial, who had seen the nightly news coverage and read the court transcripts, the memory remained. It wasn't a loud memory. It whispered, through backyards, through coffee shop conversations, through a quiet glance toward the street where Ryan and Sarah once lived. It was the kind of story that left behind a stillness, a pause. Sarah's family never spoke in public, not after the trial, not during sentencing, not in the years that followed. And perhaps that was their answer. They had said what they needed to say in their silence. To them, the case was over. Sarah was gone, and no number of interviews or statements could bring her back. For Ryan's parents, though, the battle continued, if not in the courtroom, then in the quiet moments of everyday life. They carried his story in every conversation, in every letter, in every visit. They never accepted the verdict, not because they were blind to what happened, but because they believed what their son had told them, that he didn't do it, that Sarah's death was a tragic accident, that science had failed them, that justice had misunderstood. And even after all these years, they continued to hope that someday someone would look again and see what they saw. But the law does not move easily once a verdict is reached. And in the eyes of the state, Ryan Widmer's guilt was settled. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. Each trial reaffirmed the previous one. Each jury, presented with the same facts, reached the same conclusion. And with each conclusion, the walls of certainty were built higher. Still, for those who watched the case unfold from the outside, nothing ever felt complete. The case had all the elements of a tragedy: a young couple, a sudden death, conflicting science, emotional courtroom scenes, families torn apart. But unlike most stories, it ended not with clarity, but with doubt. And that doubt became its own kind of verdict, a quiet one, unspoken but felt. A verdict that didn't appear in court documents or transcripts, but lived on in conversations that ended with a sigh, a shake of the head, or the words, "I still don't know what really happened." Years passed. The courtroom that once buzzed with arguments and emotion now sat quiet. The jurors had gone back to their lives. The prosecutors and defense attorneys had taken on new cases. Reporters had shifted to the next story. But the Whittemore case still lived in quiet spaces, in memory, in conversation, in questions that refused to go away. In Ryan's prison cell, time moved slowly. Each morning looked like the last. Wake-up call, roll call, a short walk, meals at the same hour, lights out at the same time. The days were long, but the weeks were short. They blurred together. Outside those walls, fewer people talked about the case. But when they did, it always led back to the same debate. Was Ryan guilty, or had something been missed? For every person convinced of guilt, there was another unsure. And for every theory about what happened in that bathroom, there was another question left unanswered. The echo of Sarah's death was never loud. It didn't scream or shake walls. It whispered, a soft, persistent noise that tugged at thoughts long after the case had ended. People close to Sarah still remembered her smile, her quiet nature, her love for teaching. She had worked hard to build a life, college, job, marriage. She was only 24 when it all stopped. Her former coworkers remembered the shock, the phone call, the news article, the funeral. They remembered how impossible it felt and how quickly everything changed after that. The Sarah they knew had never shown signs of trouble. She laughed with her students. She planned lessons. She talked about the future. No one saw what was coming, and once it happened, no one could explain it. Ryan had spoken to reporters a few times over the years, but never with new information. His voice remained steady. His story didn't change. He said Sarah had taken a bath while he watched TV, that she'd fallen asleep, that he found her face down, that he pulled her out and tried to help, and that it all happened so fast. Nothing added, nothing removed. And maybe that consistency brought comfort to some, but to others it raised doubts. Because real stories, they said, shift over time. They gain details. They grow with memory. But Ryan's never did. It stayed still, unchanging through trial after trial, year after year. And for some, that made it seem honest. For others, rehearsed. The bruises on Sarah's body remained a central point of debate. Some experts had said they showed signs of struggle. Others insisted they came from efforts to save her. But no one could say for certain. The bathroom scene still puzzled investigators. Dry floors, dry rugs, damp hair. What had really happened? Had Ryan pulled her out quickly? Had water drained before he called 911? Was it possible to move someone from a full tub without leaving more of a mess? Those questions had been asked dozens of times, and every answer was followed by a counterpoint. Friends of the couple stayed mostly silent. Few gave interviews. Some expressed shock at what had happened. Others said they couldn't believe Ryan would do such a thing, but time had scattered those friendships. New lives, new jobs, new relationships. The case had become a memory, frozen in one moment. For those who knew Ryan and Sarah back then, the couple was remembered not just for how it ended, but for how it began. They had been just two people starting out, a house, a cat, plans for the future. And then, in one night, everything fell apart. The Whittemore family remained loyal. Ryan's mother spoke about her son with calm clarity. She believed he had been treated unfairly. She believed the evidence was misunderstood. She believed the system had failed. She had watched the trials, heard the experts, studied the records, and through it all, she held firm to the belief that Ryan didn't do it. Her visits to the prison were quiet, steady. Each time she left the facility carrying the same thing, her son's unchanged words, that he didn't know what had happened to Sarah, only that she had gone too soon. The Stewart family, the ones who lost Sarah, never gave public statements. Their silence was steady. They never interrupted court. They never gave interviews. They never sought the spotlight. They simply showed up to every hearing, every trial, every sentence. And then they returned home. Whatever grief they carried it privately. Whatever they believed about Ryan, right or wrong, they kept to themselves. But their presence had been unmistakable. They had stood with quiet strength, just feet from the man they believed was responsible. And that silence spoke volumes. In the world beyond the courtroom, people forgot quickly. News cycles moved on. New tragedies replaced old ones. But in quiet corners of forums, in law school discussions, in true crime conversations, the Widmer case returned. People debated the bathtub, the timeline, the 911 call. They asked the same things over and over. How did she drown? Why were there bruises? Was it sleep? A medical issue? Something else? And each time the story was retold, the questions returned. Because the truth had never been fully clear. And in true crime, uncertainty is louder than any headline. It lingers, it repeats, it echoes. Inside his cell, Ryan aged. His hair thinned, his face changed, but his story did not. He continued to maintain his innocence. He served his time without incident, kept to himself, wrote letters, waited. Parole hearings would come eventually, but the road ahead was long, and parole wasn't a promise, especially not for someone who had never confessed. Still, he waited, because that's all he could do. The house where it all happened still stood. New families had moved in, new memories were made. But some neighbors remembered. They remembered the night of the sirens, the headlines, the trials, the questions. And though time had softened the memory, it hadn't erased it. Because some stories don't end with a verdict. They just quiet down, waiting, replaying, echoing through time. Ryan Widmer had once been a newlywed, a young man with a home, a job, and plans for the future. But now, his world had narrowed down to steel doors, numbered uniforms, and carefully measured days. Life behind bars was not dramatic. It was repetitive, silent, slow. The clatter of trays in the cafeteria, the echo of footsteps down concrete halls, the silence of locked cells. These sounds became the background music of his years. Waiting became a routine. He waited for letters, he waited for visits, he waited for time to pass. And most of all, he waited for the possibility of a future he no longer controlled. Each year, the questions returned, usually when someone brought the case back into the public eye. A podcast, a documentary segment, an article re-examining unsolved or controversial convictions. The Widmer case always found its way back into those discussions. Not because there was new evidence, not because the verdict had changed, but because the story still felt unfinished. People continued to ask, was justice truly served? They studied the court documents. They reviewed the expert testimony. They debated whether the bruises meant violence or something else. And still, the answers remained the same. No new discoveries, no new confessions. Only the same information told again and again. Inside prison, Ryan maintained his routine. He didn't speak to the press unless necessary. He didn't involve himself in high-profile prison events. He kept a low profile. Those who did visit said he seemed steady, calm, focused. Not angry, but stuck in time. He didn't speak much about the future. He didn't speculate. He stayed grounded in what he knew, that his life had changed in one night, and that the story people believed about him would likely never change. Still, he hoped. He hoped that maybe one day, someone might take a second look, not with new facts, but with fresh eyes. Meanwhile, Sarah's story remained quiet. Her family continued their silence. No interviews, no public appeals, no memorial campaigns. Their loss was deeply personal, and they carried it with privacy. Sarah's friends moved forward too. Some married, some had children, some changed careers. But every now and then, they remembered. A photo in an old album, a social media memory, a moment when they realized how many years had passed. Sarah had been only 24. Her life was full of plans, teaching, starting a family, growing old with someone she trusted, all of it gone in a single evening. The house where it all happened faded into suburban normalcy. Neighbors stopped whispering, children played nearby, new faces moved in, To someone driving by, it was just another home. But to a few, it was still a place marked by silence, by the memory of that night, and by the mystery no one ever fully solved. For the legal system, the case had ended. Ryan's appeals had been reviewed. Each trial had concluded with the same result. Each request for reconsideration had been denied. The paperwork was filed, the transcript stored. On paper, it was closed, but in real life, it wasn't. Because when a case is built on interpretation, when the evidence is open to opposing expert views, closure is harder to find. Some believe that uncertainty should have led to acquittal. Others believed that uncertainty didn't erase guilt, and both sides held firm. Ryan's supporters stayed in the background, but they never disappeared. They continued to believe that the system had failed, that the timeline didn't make sense, that the medical analysis was flawed. They pointed to the same issues: the dry bathroom, the 911 call, the lack of water in the lungs, the possible sleep issues, the CPR bruising. To them, none of it added up to murder. They wrote letters, made posts, privately continued their advocacy, but they knew the road ahead was long and uncertain, especially without new evidence. For Ryan, parole would be the only path forward. But parole was complicated. He hadn't confessed, he hadn't accepted guilt, and that often weighed heavily in the decision-making process. To grant parole, boards often looked for signs of remorse, acknowledgement, rehabilitation. But how does someone express remorse for something they claim they didn't do? It became a loop, one that many in Ryan's position faced. And so he waited, without guarantees, without timelines, without knowing if the door would ever open. Back in the public, most people had moved on. But the Widmer case continued to live quietly in documentaries and classroom discussions. Law students studied it for the lessons in procedure. Medical professionals debated the autopsy. True crime audiences discussed it late into the night. Each group brought a different lens. Each arrived at different conclusions, and none could change what had already been decided. Ryan Widmer's life had become one of stillness. His days unfolded inside concrete walls. The world outside kept turning, and the woman at the center of the story, Sarah, remained frozen in memory. Still 24, still a newlywed, still silent. Years had passed, but the Ryan Widmer case refused to stay quiet. It would resurface without warning, in a podcast episode, a documentary series, or an article revisiting high-profile convictions. Though the trials had long concluded and the prison doors had closed behind Ryan, the story still stirred curiosity and debate. People who had never met Sarah or Ryan found themselves drawn to the strange details. The dry bathroom floor, the timeline that felt too fast, the bruises that divided medical experts, and the three trials that, despite their differences, all pointed to the same outcome. The case didn't fade, it lingered. Not because something new had come to light, but because what was already known had never been easy to understand. Among true crime followers, the Widmer story became a frequent topic. Online forums filled with threads rehashing every detail. Some users believed Ryan had clearly done it, pointing to Sarah's injuries, the way he spoke on the 911 call, and the prosecution's timeline. Others argued that nothing truly proved guilt. They mentioned the sleep studies, the dry rugs that could have dried during CPR, the expert disagreements, and the fact that no one, not even the experts, could say for certain what had caused Sarah's death. It was a case built on interpretation, and interpretation by its nature invites argument. Even in legal communities, the case remained a reference point. Some professors used it in law school classes to highlight how different trials can lead to the same result, or how science in the courtroom often becomes a battle between competing narratives. One legal analyst explained that juries aren't always choosing between fact and fiction. Sometimes, they're choosing between two versions of doubt. That had been true in Ryan's case. 3 separate juries, all presented with slightly different evidence, had ultimately reached the same conclusion. But that didn't settle the debate. If anything, it deepened it. For Ryan, none of that changed his reality. He was still serving his sentence, 15 years to life. He had lost his appeals, and he still insisted on his innocence. He rarely spoke publicly, but when he did, his words stayed the same. He said Sarah had fallen asleep in the tub, that he found her too late, that he did everything he could once he realized what had happened, that there was no fight, no harm, no crime, just a tragedy. And no matter how many times he said it, there were always people who didn't believe him. Inside the prison walls, life went on with quiet repetition. Meals, roll call, letters, reading, sleep. There was little change. Ryan had no major infractions. He stayed to himself. He lived in a space that was silent about his past, yet built around it. Inmates came and went, but Ryan remained, waiting, serving time for something he said he didn't do. Outside, Sarah's memory lived on in subtle ways. She hadn't become a national figure. There were no books written in her name, no foundations, no televised specials focused solely on her life. But her absence was deeply felt by those who had loved her. Her students, her coworkers, her family, her friends. They remembered her not as a case, but as a person. And that remembrance didn't need to be loud. It existed quietly, in photos kept in frames, in birthdays missed, in the space where her life would have continued. People who had followed the case since the beginning could still recite the timeline. August 2008, married for 4 months, Sarah took a bath. Ryan watched TV. The Bengals game played in the background. Then the scream, the call to 911, the dry bathroom, the questions, the arrest, the trial, the mistrial, the second trial, the third trial, the verdict, the appeal, and finally, silence. That series of events remained fixed, unchanging, permanent. But interpretation shifted with time. Some who had believed in his guilt began to doubt. Others who had doubted became convinced. And the story continued not because it had changed, but because it hadn't. True crime programs continued to mention the Widmer case. Often they included it in episodes about controversial convictions. They re-aired courtroom footage, they re-quoted expert testimony, they replayed parts of the 911 call. And in every episode, the same question closed the story. What really happened in that bathroom? It was a question no court could fully answer, because the evidence left room for uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, the debate thrived. Ryan's name faded from daily conversation, but it remained in public records, in prison rosters, in legal citations, in archived news footage. His life became divided into two parts, before August 2008 and after. One half filled with plans and beginnings, the other with courtrooms, confinement, and silence. He didn't speak much about what came next. He didn't speculate. He didn't ask for sympathy. He simply maintained the same words he had spoken since that night, that he hadn't hurt Sarah, that she had drowned, and that he didn't know how it had happened. As the years went on, the Widmer case remained a topic of scrutiny, and when people discussed it, they always came back to the same place, the evidence. They revisited the autopsy. They reviewed the testimony. They dissected the timeline down to the minute. Because even though 3 trials had taken place, many still felt that something had been left unresolved. They weren't looking for new facts. There were none. They were looking to understand the facts that already existed. And in doing so, they hoped to finally make sense of a case that never felt entirely clear. At the center of everything was Sarah. She had died in the bathtub. There were bruises. There were signs of a struggle, according to some. Others disagreed. The defense argued that the injuries could have been caused during CPR. That water could have drained naturally while Ryan followed the 911 dispatcher's instructions. That Sarah's body might not have been fully submerged when he found her. But the prosecution saw it differently. They said the bruises told a story of force, of a violent encounter that happened in a small enclosed space. They argued that Ryan had acted in anger, that he had overpowered Sarah, that the signs were there, and that they pointed to one conclusion: murder. The 911 call remained a key point. Ryan sounded breathless, stressed, confused, but not, some said, like someone who had just found his wife lifeless in a tub. The prosecution played that call repeatedly. They pointed to his tone, his pauses, his answers. They said it didn't match the panic of the moment, but the defense pushed back. They said people react differently to trauma, that there's no standard way to grieve, no perfect way to sound in an emergency. They argued that Ryan's voice reflected shock, not guilt. And then there was the bathroom. The floor was dry, the towels untouched, the rug didn't feel wet. The prosecution said it made no sense. If Sarah had been pulled from a full tub, the room should have been soaked. There should have been water on the walls, the floor, the mat, everywhere. But the defense had a different explanation. They said Ryan had pulled her out quickly, that she wasn't fully submerged, that the water level wasn't as high as people assumed. They even suggested that the dispatcher's instructions to drain the tub could explain the dry surroundings. And so, once again, the jury had to decide which version made more sense. The autopsy report added more complexity. Sarah's lungs were heavy. She had bruises on her neck, on her arms. But not all experts agreed on what that meant. Some said the lung findings were consistent with drowning. Others said they were inconclusive. Some called the bruises signs of restraint. Others said they could have been caused by resuscitation. Each opinion was met with a counter. Each answer brought a new question. And in the end, it was left to the jury, not the doctors, to decide which voices they believed. One of the most talked about moments during the trial involved Ryan's behavior. He had removed the computer from their bedroom before police arrived. He had mentioned brushing his teeth. He had gone downstairs after calling 911. To the prosecution, those actions seemed strange, too calm, too calculated. But the defense reminded the court that trauma affects the brain, that people in shock don't always act rationally, that grief can look like detachment. And once again, the lines between guilt and confusion became hard to draw. In their closing arguments, the prosecution leaned into certainty. They said the facts, taken together, showed intent. They said the scene didn't make sense unless someone had acted deliberately, that Sarah didn't die by accident or illness, that Ryan was responsible. But the defense leaned into doubt. They pointed to the lack of direct evidence, to the inconsistencies in the expert testimony, to the absence of motive. They said Ryan had no history of violence, no reason to harm Sarah, no benefit to her death. And they reminded the jury that doubt, reasonable doubt, was enough. That the law did not require certainty, only clarity. But clarity proved elusive. Even after the verdict, the case remained tangled in conflicting interpretations. People revisiting the evidence still saw what they wanted to see. They believed the version that matched their instincts. And that made the case endlessly debatable. Because when the facts are open to interpretation, the arguments never end. For the Widmer case, the evidence was both the foundation and the fracture. It was what held the case together and what kept it unsettled. Because it never gave anyone the full story, only fragments. And from those fragments, everyone had built their own conclusion. In each of Ryan Widmer's 3 trials, expert witnesses were called to the stand. Some were medical professionals, others were forensic pathologists or emergency responders. All were brought in to make sense of what had happened to Sarah. But instead of creating clarity, their testimony introduced something else: conflict. The experts didn't agree, not fully, not consistently, and those disagreements became central to how people interpreted the case. The autopsy showed bruises on Sarah's neck and scalp, on her arms, and on other parts of her body. Some experts testified that these bruises could only have come from force, deliberate, sustained, and violent. They said the marks were consistent with restraint, with someone grabbing her, with a struggle that might have occurred in or near the tub. They pointed to specific shapes, sizes, and locations of the injuries and argued that this wasn't a simple drowning. But the defense had its own experts, and they said something different. They said the bruises could easily have come from Ryan's attempts at CPR, that pulling a slippery, unresponsive body from a tub could leave marks, that chest compressions could cause bruising, especially if done forcefully. They showed examples, they explained techniques, and they argued that what the prosecution called proof of harm could actually be signs of help. This back and forth played out across all 3 trials. Each time the jury heard medical terms, autopsy interpretations, explanations about drowning, aspiration, timing, tissue damage. Each side made a compelling case, but neither could completely disprove the other. And that left the jury and the public with a difficult task to decide which expert to believe. One of the most debated points was whether Sarah's death had followed a classic drowning pattern. The prosecution insisted that it hadn't. They said her body showed signs of something else, of trauma, of force. They argued that her lungs weren't as full of water as they should have been if she had drowned in the usual sense. That certain signs, like petechiae or foam in the airways, were missing or inconsistent. But the defense responded with their own analysis. They brought in doctors who said drowning can look different depending on the circumstances. That in a short time or in certain medical conditions, classic signs may not appear. They said it was possible Sarah had drowned quickly, or that she may have passed out first due to a medical event, like a heart arrhythmia or a seizure, and that drowning had followed. And again, the jury had to weigh those possibilities, not by deciding which one was proven, but by asking which one seemed more likely. There was also disagreement about the timing of the bruises. Some said they happened before death. Others said they might have occurred after, during the resuscitation efforts. That single difference in interpretation changed the narrative entirely. If the bruises happened before death, they might show a struggle. If they happened after, they could show an attempt to save her. And there was no way to say definitively which was true. The lack of agreement extended to Sarah's potential medical history. Ryan had said she sometimes fell asleep easily. He had mentioned her sleep habits to police. The defense used that to argue she might have fallen asleep in the tub and slipped underwater, that it could have been a tragic accident. They even called a sleep expert to testify. Someone who explained that a person could have a sleep disorder without ever being diagnosed. That Sarah's habits, as described by Ryan, were consistent with certain conditions. But the prosecution didn't find it persuasive. They argued that the entire medical explanation was based on speculation, that no doctor had ever diagnosed Sarah with anything serious, that she had no known illness and no history of passing out. They said the drowning wasn't medical, it was mechanical, caused by someone holding her down. For the jury, it was a mountain of information, terms they had never heard before, charts, diagrams, timelines, autopsy photos, and for every point made by one side, the other had a response. It wasn't like TV. There was no moment when everything suddenly made sense. There was only contrast, expert versus expert, opinion versus opinion, possibility versus probability. And in the end, the decision didn't come from science. It came from how jurors interpreted the expert's tone, confidence, and explanations, from how persuasive each person seemed, from the feeling that one story fit better than the other. For many who followed the case, this was the part that stayed with them, that even with 3 trials, there had never been complete agreement, not from the doctors, not from the police, not even from the public. And in a case built on physical evidence, that lack of agreement mattered, because where science divides, doubt survives. And doubt, once introduced, is hard to ignore. After the 3rd trial ended in a conviction, Ryan Widmer's legal team prepared for what would be their final fight, the appeals process. It was their last chance to undo the outcome, their last opportunity to argue that something had gone wrong, not with their story, but with the system itself. This phase wasn't about emotions or new witnesses. It was about law, about whether the procedures had been fair, about whether the rules had been followed, and whether Ryan's conviction had been legally sound. The defense argued several points. They claimed that errors had been made during the trials, mistakes that may have influenced the jury's verdict. They questioned the way evidence had been handled. They questioned whether some expert testimony had been presented unfairly. They questioned whether the judge's instructions to the jury had been clear enough. And they argued that some of the decisions made during trial, such as the admission of certain statements or the exclusion of others, had worked against Ryan. In short, they said the process had been flawed, that even if someone believed Ryan might be guilty, he had not been convicted in a fair, unbiased courtroom. The appellate court reviewed the records. They looked at the transcripts. They considered the arguments. They examined whether the judge had allowed or disallowed evidence appropriately, whether the legal standards had been upheld, whether the jury had received proper guidance in weighing the expert testimony. But appeals courts are limited. They do not retry cases. They do not hear new witnesses or reconsider facts. They simply decide whether the original trial had been conducted correctly under the law. And after their review, the decision came. The court ruled against Ryan. They upheld the conviction. They found no legal errors serious enough to reverse the outcome. The verdict would stand. The sentence would remain. The Widmer case would not be reopened. For Ryan, it was the end of the legal road. He had gone through 3 trials, faced multiple juries, sat through hours of expert debate, watched his attorneys fight through appeal after appeal, and now there was nowhere else to go. Not in the courtroom, not in the eyes of the law. He was a convicted man, sentenced to 15 years to life, with the only path forward being parole, something uncertain, something distant. Outside the prison, the public reacted in different ways. Some believed justice had finally run its full course, that Ryan had been given every chance, and that the outcome had been just. Others still had doubts. They didn't question the court's authority, but they questioned whether the system had captured the truth, because the same facts that had raised uncertainty before the appeal were still there afterward. The bruises, the dry bathroom, the 911 call, the timeline. And the question of how, in such a short span of time, Sarah had died without anyone witnessing a thing. For Sarah's family, the appeal's conclusion meant peace in the form of finality. They had never spoken publicly, never sat for interviews, but they had shown up in court day after day, trial after trial, quiet, steady, present. Their silence had never been broken, but their presence had always been clear. They believed the verdict. They accepted the court's conclusion. And now, with the appeals closed, they could begin to leave the courtroom behind. For Ryan's family, it was a different kind of ending. They believed in his innocence. They believed something had been missed, misunderstood. And the appeals denial felt like the system turning away, like a door being shut without listening. They knew that parole could still come one day, but that wasn't justice in their eyes. That was simply time passing. To them, justice meant truth, and they still believed that truth had not been found. After the appeal, media coverage slowed. There were no new updates to report, no new hearings to cover. The headlines faded. The public turned to newer stories, and the Widmer case became part of the past, but it never vanished completely. In law classes, in true crime documentaries, in online discussions, it continued to be a case people returned to, not for resolution, but for reflection, because it represented something uncomfortable. A death no one saw, a story no one could fully prove, and a verdict many still struggled to understand. Before August 11, 2008, Ryan Widmer's life had looked typical from the outside. He was 27, he had a stable job, he lived in a quiet neighborhood in Warren County, Ohio, and he had recently married Sarah. They were only 4 months into their marriage. Their home was new, their future still unwritten. They had plans, ordinary ones, vacations to take, furniture to buy, careers to grow into, children maybe someday. They were like any other couple at the start of something, until that night changed everything. Once arrested, Ryan never returned to that life. The house, the car, the routines, they all belonged to a chapter that had closed without warning. In the years that followed, those things were sold, moved, or forgotten. But what never left was the memory of what once was. Photos remained, videos from the wedding, emails, receipts for things like dinner dates and household items, all pieces of a life that had seemed so normal until it wasn't. Inside prison, Ryan held on to memories in fragments. He didn't speak much about Sarah after the trial. When asked, he would sometimes say she fell asleep in the tub, that she didn't suffer, that he had tried everything he could. He kept his answers short, measured, controlled. He didn't offer long explanations. He didn't engage in public debate. Instead, he seemed to keep his emotions contained, as though speaking too freely about the past might break him open. What made Ryan's story different from other inmates was the way he had entered the system. He hadn't lived a double life. He wasn't involved in crime before the arrest. There were no red flags, no history of violence, no trail of past charges, just a sudden, sharp collapse from husband to suspect. And for many, that made the story harder to accept. It was easier to understand guilt when it followed a pattern, but Ryan hadn't followed one, which is why, even years later, people continue to ask, what really happened? Some of his friends stood by him, even after the verdict, even after the appeal. They wrote letters, visited when they could, sent news clippings, messages of support. They didn't see a killer when they looked at Ryan. They saw the same person they'd known before, the one who smiled at his wedding, laughed at parties, and talked about plans for the future. They believed something had gone terribly wrong that night, but not in the way the court had decided. They believed Ryan had been misunderstood, that his actions after Sarah's death, his confusion, his calm, his lack of visible grief, were the result of shock, not guilt, and that once the system had decided he was guilty, there was no way back. In the years since, Ryan missed everything that might have been: birthdays, weddings, his younger relatives growing up, holidays with family, even small things, driving a car, ordering food in a restaurant, watching a game on a big screen. All the regular moments that once filled his life were now memories behind glass. And though he was alive, his presence in the world was paused, frozen in the same place where the courtroom had left him. There were no more trials to attend, no more headlines, just time, measured by days, weeks, and years, each one passing the same way: meals, reading, exercise, sleep. A rhythm that didn't change, a life suspended between what had been and what would never be again. What made it all heavier was that Sarah's family had never spoken publicly. They hadn't written op-eds. They hadn't sat for interviews. They hadn't explained what they thought of Ryan, not beyond what was said in court. And so the silence between the two families remained, not just physical, but emotional, a distance that would never be bridged, a gap that began the night Sarah died and only widened with time. For Ryan's supporters, the hardest part was the waiting for a system that rarely changed its mind, waiting for a parole hearing that could still be years away, waiting for some piece of new evidence that might not exist, and waiting for a public that had largely moved on. They held on to the belief that truth had not been fully found. But they had little left to fight with. The trials were done. The courts had spoken, and all that remained was a man behind bars, and a question still hanging in the air. Throughout the trials, the appeals, and the passing years, one voice remained quiet: Sarah's. She could no longer speak for herself. Everything about her, who she was, how she lived, how she died, had to be pieced together through the accounts of others, through photos, through witness statements, through autopsy reports, and through the silence she left behind. That silence spoke in the courtroom. It echoed in the faces of her family, and it filled every space her presence once occupied. Sarah had been a daughter, a sister, a dental hygienist. She loved children. She liked to run, to stay active. She was described as kind, organized, and thoughtful. Friends said she smiled easily. She was the kind of person who remembered birthdays, who checked in when someone seemed off. She had grown up in a stable home. She had goals, a job, a future. She had just returned from her honeymoon when everything changed. But during the trials, Sarah wasn't discussed as a person. at least not often. She was discussed as a subject, as a body, as evidence. Medical experts described her injuries. Attorneys debated what her bruises meant. Pathologists dissected her final moments in clinical terms. And though her name was spoken countless times, it rarely sounded like a name. It became part of a case, a detail in an argument, a name on a file. Not a full person. Not the way her loved ones remembered her. Her family never stepped into the spotlight. They never gave interviews. They never explained what they believed had happened that night. But their presence said enough. In every courtroom session, they sat in the gallery. They didn't speak. They didn't react. But they were always there, steady, composed. And when the guilty verdict came in, they didn't cheer. They didn't weep in public. They just remained still, holding each other, quietly absorbing the weight of it. That silence became Sarah's voice, a steady, unshaken presence, a reflection of loss. The prosecution spoke on behalf of Sarah. They described her final minutes. They showed autopsy photos, outlined her injuries, pointed to the bruises. They said she had been silenced by force, that what happened in that bathroom had been no accident, that she had fought, and that her body told a story she couldn't. The defense told a different version. They said she may have fallen asleep, that her medical condition, if there was one, had gone undiagnosed, that she had slipped underwater before Ryan even knew something was wrong. They didn't speak unkindly of her. They didn't place blame. They only challenged the conclusion. They said her body couldn't speak clearly enough to determine guilt, that there were too many uncertainties, too many explanations, too much doubt. What remained was the absence of Sarah's own version, what she felt that night, what she saw, what she might have said if she had the chance. That silence left a gap no trial could fill, and because of that, the case always felt incomplete. In her hometown, people still remembered Sarah. Though her story faded from headlines, it didn't fade from memory. Coworkers recalled her professionalism. Neighbors remembered her jogging in the early evenings. Family friends spoke of her smile and her patience. She hadn't lived a life that drew attention, but her death had, and that contrast, the quiet life and the noisy aftermath, remained unsettling. In the years that followed, her family marked anniversaries quietly. No public statements, no press conferences, only private grief. Only the kind of remembrance that doesn't ask to be seen. They visited her grave. They kept her pictures. They preserved her memory in the ways that mattered to them, away from the cameras, away from the arguments, away from the courtroom. Sarah's voice may have been lost the night she died, but in silence, she remained present. In the courtroom stillness, in the witness of her family, in the quiet details that told the story of who she was before that final night, and in the memory of a life that was full before it was suddenly gone. As the years went by, the Widmer case drew attention far beyond Ohio. People who had never met Ryan or Sarah formed opinions based on the headlines, the televised trials, and the courtroom sketches. For some, the story was clear. For others, it remained full of unanswered questions. It didn't take long before the public split into two groups, supporters and skeptics. Both followed the same case. Both saw the same evidence. And yet, they walked away with very different conclusions. Ryan's supporters pointed to the lack of direct evidence. They emphasized the absence of witnesses, the lack of motive, and the inconsistent expert testimony. They believed in his innocence. To them, Ryan was not a violent man. He had no history of abuse, no prior arrests, and no warning signs. His relationship with Sarah, they said, had been stable, loving. There were no reports of fights, no allegations of mistreatment, and no signs of tension in their marriage. They saw Ryan as someone who had suffered a terrible loss, and then became the main suspect simply because no one could explain what had happened. Some of his strongest supporters were people he had never met. They learned about the case through newspapers, documentaries, and online forums. They studied court transcripts, examined photos, and listened to hours of expert testimony. and the more they read, the more convinced they became that something wasn't right. They wrote letters on his behalf. They created websites to tell his side of the story. They pointed out the unusual elements, the dry bathroom, the time gaps, the medical theories, and insisted that the system had rushed to judgment. To them, Ryan's case represented more than one man's fate. It represented how uncertain evidence can still lead to a permanent consequence. But there were skeptics too. People who believed the jury had made the right call. They focused on the bruises, the 911 call, and Ryan's behavior that night. They questioned his reactions, his version of events. They didn't see a grieving husband. They saw a story that didn't add up. They believed the prosecution's narrative, that Ryan had lost control, that Sarah had fought back, and that the evidence on her body supported that conclusion. To them, justice had been served, not rushed, not flawed, just difficult. Skeptics didn't dismiss the complexity of the case. They acknowledged the challenges, the multiple trials, the expert disagreements, and the appeal process. But in the end, they believed the outcome had been earned through careful deliberation, and they trusted the jury's ability to weigh the evidence. They believed Ryan had the opportunity to defend himself, that the court had reviewed the case fairly, and that the verdict, though painful, was based on the facts. Public debate about the case didn't always stay respectful. On online forums, emotions ran high. Some accused the other side of ignoring key facts. Others accused jurors of being misled. There were arguments about science, arguments about the meaning of grief, even arguments about what kind of person Ryan had been. It showed how personal true crime can become, how a story about two people can become a mirror for how others see the world, how people interpret fairness, guilt, and tragedy. In the midst of that noise, Ryan stayed mostly silent. He didn't give interviews. He didn't speak to the press. His statements came through letters or court filings, never long, never emotional. Some said that silence made him seem distant. Others said it showed restraint. His supporters believed he had nothing to gain by speaking out, that no matter what he said, it would be twisted. So instead, he remained still, just as Sarah's family had. Over time, attention faded, not because the case was resolved in everyone's minds, but because newer stories replaced it. New trials, new headlines. But for those closest to Ryan, and for those who still believed in his innocence, the case never went away. They continued to revisit it, to study it, to look for anything, any small piece that might bring clarity. And for the skeptics, the case remained a reminder of how justice sometimes means making a decision even when the full truth may never be known. Both groups agreed on one thing. The Widmer case was not easy to understand. Not because the facts weren't available, but because the facts didn't speak clearly. They had to be interpreted. They had to be weighed. And that made the difference. Because in the absence of absolute proof, belief filled the gaps. And belief, once formed, is hard to undo. Long after the courtroom lights dimmed and the appeals came to an end, the Widmer case lived on. Not in legal books, but in the minds of those who followed it. For some, it was a reminder of how grief can be mistaken for guilt. For others, it was proof that even the most ordinary lives can hide unthinkable moments. And in the years that followed, the memory of the case stayed divided. Not erased, not forgotten, just separated between what people believed and what they feared might still be true. There were those who never doubted the verdict. To them, justice had spoken. 3 trials, expert witnesses, forensic evidence, none of it had been rushed. The jury, after long hours of listening and weighing, had made its decision. Sarah's bruises, the unexplained timeline, the dry bathroom. To this group, those pieces weren't fragments. They were the story. And Ryan's calm 911 call, his lack of urgency, his composed demeanor. They read those details not as signs of trauma, but of control, of guilt. But there was another group, just as committed, who saw the exact same pieces and came to a different conclusion. They remembered Ryan's tears in court, his voice breaking during interviews with police, his shock, his loss, the confusion of that night. They pointed out that there had been no eyewitnesses, no history of violence, no clear motive. They said the case had been built on possibility, not certainty, and that once a story is told enough times, even doubt can begin to sound like proof. This divide wasn't just legal, it became emotional, personal, because the Widmer case touched on something deeper: how people view the justice system, how they understand innocence, how they interpret silence or emotion or the absence of either. And so, memory of the case became less about facts and more about the lens through which people saw them. In online forums, the discussion never quite ended. Years later, new users would stumble upon a video clip or article and find themselves drawn in. Why didn't the bathroom floor have water? Could someone really drown so quickly? Why would a husband kill his wife 4 months into marriage? Each question led to another. Each answer opened more space for uncertainty. The facts were the same, but the meaning of them never settled. Journalists who had covered the case often reflected on how polarizing it had been. Even within newsrooms, editors and reporters sometimes disagreed on the story's weight. Was it a straightforward crime, or a cautionary tale about how suspicion can turn into conviction? Years passed, but the questions remained fresh. Not because new evidence came forward, but because the case had never offered closure. Not to the public, not to the families, not even to the experts who had testified. For those close to Sarah, the memory of her wasn't tied to arguments. It was personal. It was a life lived with grace, and a death that came far too soon. They remembered her in quiet ways: photos, letters, family holidays missing her presence. They never joined the debate. They didn't have to. Their grief didn't need explaining. It simply remained. For those close to Ryan, the memory of what was lost came with added weight, not just of Sarah, but of a life interrupted, a future gone, a name now linked forever to suspicion. They remembered the Ryan who had laughed on his wedding day, the one who dreamed of building a life, not ending one. And they lived with the ache of watching someone they loved disappear into a system that didn't allow space for doubt. Some people moved on. They heard the story once and never returned to it. For them, it was just another case, an episode in a series, a chapter in a book. But for others, it lingered, not because of drama, not because of violence, but because of uncertainty. Because when the facts don't fit neatly together, the mind keeps trying to rearrange them, keeps looking for the piece that will make it all make sense. The Widmer case didn't end with a twist. There was no confession, no hidden evidence, no sudden reversal of fate, only a decision, a sentence, and a long silence that followed. From the moment Ryan Widmer was arrested, his story became more than a legal case. It became a media story. It was on the evening news. It made headlines in Ohio, and then across the country. Soon, it was everywhere, on true crime programs, morning shows, and national networks. The narrative had been set: a young wife, a suburban home, a husband accused, and with those elements, the public's attention locked in. Because stories like that don't just pass through quietly. They stay, they stir, they sell. The media didn't invent the facts, but it shaped how they were seen. Every word Ryan spoke in interviews was analyzed. Every tear or lack of one was interpreted. News anchors asked, "Why would he do it?" before anyone proved that he had. Headlines used the word mystery in bold fonts, and photos of Sarah, smiling, young, radiant, accompanied articles filled with speculation. Each piece of coverage, each voiceover, became another frame through which people saw the case. Television brought the courtroom into living rooms. Viewers watched expert witnesses argue over bruises and timelines. They saw Ryan in a suit, sitting quietly beside his lawyers. They heard prosecutors describe the final moments of Sarah's life with certainty, and they heard the defense push back with medical theories and alternate explanations. But even when the legal arguments were balanced, the tone wasn't always neutral, because media doesn't just report, it narrates. And sometimes that narration carries weight. When clips of the 911 call were played on air, people formed opinions based on Ryan's voice alone. Was he calm? Too calm? Was he panicked? Not enough? Every pause, every breath, every sentence was dissected. And once something is seen on television, it becomes more than just evidence. It becomes part of a story that's already being told. Some reporters tried to be fair. They reminded viewers that Ryan was presumed innocent, that the case was still unfolding, that the jury had not yet decided. But others leaned into the drama, into the emotional pull of the story. And the more airtime the case received, the harder it became for people to see it without the background music, the voiceovers, the headlines. True crime programs later picked up the story. They condensed years of proceedings into hour-long episodes, cutting between interviews, reenactments, and dramatic narration. They showed diagrams of the bathroom. They outlined the timeline. They replayed courtroom footage and interviews with law enforcement. And even though they didn't create the facts, their presentation shaped perception. Because when viewers are shown a sequence of images, they begin to feel like they understand what happened, even when the truth remains uncertain. The media attention wasn't only national, it was local too. Local newspapers covered the case with daily updates. Their readers followed every development, from the initial arrest to the third trial, from the appeal to the final ruling. People talked about it in grocery stores, at church, on front porches. It became more than news. It became part of community conversation. And with that, it became harder for Ryan to be seen as just a man facing trial. He became a figure, a name, a headline. Ryan's defense team raised concerns about the media's impact. They worried it might influence potential jurors, that it might shape public opinion before the trial even began. They filed motions to move the trial to a different county, to reduce the risk of bias, to ensure fairness. But even when the location changed, the media coverage followed, and the story continued to grow. For Sarah's family, the attention brought a different kind of pain. Each headline was a reminder. Each news segment replayed the worst day of their lives. And because they chose not to speak publicly, their silence was often filled in by others, by reporters, by commentators, by strangers on the internet. They couldn't control the narrative. They could only endure it. When the final verdict was read, the media delivered it instantly. TV crawlers announced the decision. News websites published updates within minutes. Photos of Ryan, eyes lowered, were shared again, and the story reached its legal end. But the coverage didn't stop, because the public still had questions, still had doubts, still had theories. And the media, as always, gave those theories space to breathe. In the end, the story of Ryan and Sarah Widmer was told through two parallel channels, one in the courtroom and one on the screen. The first had rules, the second had reach. And once the public had seen it all through the lens of television and newsprint, the lines between legal truth and public narrative became harder to see. The legal process had run its course. The verdict had been read. Appeals had been filed, reviewed, and denied. Years had passed. But even with all the steps followed and the procedures observed, one thing still remained: uncertainty. A future with no clear answers for Ryan, for Sarah's family, and for everyone who followed the case from beginning to end. In a typical case, a conviction brings closure. A confession or indisputable evidence allows people to move forward. But this wasn't that kind of case. There was no recording of what happened, no eyewitness, no motive that made sense to everyone. And even though a jury had spoken, many still carried doubt. Not because they didn't respect the verdict, but because the story felt unfinished, incomplete. Sarah's parents never gave interviews. They never said publicly what they believed had happened in that bathroom. But they sat through each trial. They watched every moment, heard every theory, and in the end, They walked out of the courtroom, holding tightly to one another. Their silence was not loud, but it was powerful. And maybe for them, no words were needed, only grief, only memory, only the weight of absence. Ryan, on the other hand, faced the future within walls. He maintained his version of the night. Sarah had taken a bath. She had fallen asleep. He had found her unresponsive and called for help. That story never changed. Not after the arrest. Not after the first trial. Not after the second. And not after the third. To those who believed him, that consistency meant something. To those who didn't, it raised questions of its own. But no new version ever came. No confession, no elaboration. Just the same account, told again and again in the same quiet way. For his family, life continued without him. Holidays, birthdays, weddings. They visited him when they could, wrote letters, held on to hope. But each visit ended the same way, with the door closing behind them and time continuing without him. They didn't stop believing, but belief doesn't open locked doors, or rewind time, or erase headlines. Outside the prison, the world moved on. The case faded from daily conversation. New stories took its place, but for those who had lived inside it, the aftermath lingered. For Sarah's loved ones, her absence remained the center of gravity, an invisible presence in every room, at every gathering. Her voice, her laugh, her future gone, but never forgotten, never far. For Ryan's circle, the days moved in slow rhythm, counted in years served, appeals exhausted, milestones missed. Each side lived with a loss, and neither could change what had been. What the Widmer case left behind wasn't just a legal record, it was a question. One that echoed even after the final ruling. Not what happened, because that had been asked already, but why don't we know for sure? And that question didn't have an answer. Not in the evidence, not in the testimony, not in the verdict. It was the kind of question that time doesn't resolve. Because time brings distance, but not always clarity. Some believed Ryan would one day be released. Others believed he shouldn't. Some hoped for new evidence. Others felt the case had already been too drawn out. But no matter what people believed, the reality was the same. Sarah was gone. Ryan was in prison. And the story that had once captured a nation's attention had quieted into stillness. No new twists, no final reveal. Just the lasting silence of something unresolved. In the end, this was a case not about spectacle, but about doubt. Doubt that never fully settled. Justice had been served, as the courts decided, but closure? That was another matter, and for many it never came. Only time passed, and with it, the memory of what could not be undone. As the courtrooms emptied, the headlines quieted, and the voices faded from public view. What remained were the questions. Questions that had been asked at the very beginning and never found clear answers. Not for the jury, not for the families, not for the public. The kind of questions that don't disappear just because a verdict is written into law. People still asked, how does a healthy young woman die suddenly in her bathtub? Why was the bathroom dry when first responders arrived? Could someone really fall asleep and drown without a sound? Why were there bruises? Had there been a struggle? Or were those injuries the result of a failed rescue? These weren't just courtroom questions. They were human ones, simple, direct, emotional. And yet, even after 3 trials and years of legal debate, none of them had definitive answers. Because the evidence, while abundant, was not clear. The timelines were debated, the forensics disputed, the behavior interpreted in 2 entirely different ways. One expert saw signs of force. Another saw signs of natural collapse. One side pointed to silence as suspicious. The other called it shock. And so, every explanation came with an alternate version. Every conclusion had an equally firm rebuttal. And every attempt to close the case emotionally reopened it for someone else. For Sarah's family, there were questions they never asked publicly. But their pain was visible in every appearance, every courtroom visit, every silent exit from the courthouse. They didn't need to explain what they felt. They simply endured it and carried the weight of what had been lost. Their daughter, their sister, someone who had barely begun the next phase of her life, someone who just months earlier had walked down the aisle with a smile on her face. For Ryan, the questions took a different shape. He was the only person in the house the night Sarah died. He was the last person to see her alive. And so, he was the one whose story was placed under the microscope, repeatedly, endlessly. The same questions asked again and again. Were you in the room when she slipped under? Did you hear anything? Did you try to help? Did you panic? What happened in the time between her last words and the 911 call? Why was the towel dry? Why did your voice sound so calm? Ryan gave his answers, the same ones each time. But for many, it wasn't enough. Not because he said the wrong thing, but because they couldn't understand how the right thing could sound like that. They couldn't reconcile a tragic accident with such quiet responses. They couldn't separate confusion from concealment. And that disconnect fed the uncertainty that lingered long after the case had closed. The experts had questions too. Some forensic analysts still debated the significance of the bruises on Sarah's body. Others questioned the autopsy's ability to determine cause of death with certainty. Medical experts raised the possibility of sudden cardiac events, fainting, or positional drowning. But none of them could say with confidence, this is what happened. They could only suggest, propose, theorize. And when lives hang in the balance, theories often feel like not enough. So the questions remained, not because people refused to move on, but because they weren't finished thinking, and because in this case, every fact seemed to come with a shadow attached. Nothing stood alone. Every piece of the puzzle brought more uncertainty. And when the picture finally came together, it didn't look the same to everyone. For some, that was unacceptable. They believed a justice system should only convict when the truth is crystal clear. For others, it was reality. They believed certainty is a luxury the courts rarely afford, that sometimes decisions must be made without perfect knowledge, and that justice, even when incomplete, must move forward. The Widmer case ended with a sentence, but not with peace, and certainly not with answers, just questions, persistent, quiet, unresolved, like echoes in a room that had long since gone silent. The verdict was in: life in prison, no parole. The courtroom was silent as the words were read. There were no outbursts, no loud reactions, only the sound of breathing, of shuffling papers, of a gavel marking the end of the trial. But for those whose lives were tied to the case, the verdict didn't bring a finish line. It marked the beginning of something else entirely, living with what was decided. For Ryan Widmer, life changed permanently that day. There would be no more trials, no more chances in court, no more interviews with experts, jurors, or journalists. Just time. Time behind bars. Time to think, relive, and endure. His world was reduced to a cell, a schedule, and memories that no ruling could erase. He had once lived in a quiet neighborhood, worked a steady job, made plans. That world was gone, replaced by concrete, routine, and the same four walls. Ryan's family held on. They had supported him through each trial, every appeal, every setback. They continued to believe in him. They visited him, sent letters, shared family updates. But the distance, the emotional and physical kind, was constant. He wasn't coming home, not anytime soon, not ever, if the sentence stood. And that was a truth they had to live with, not in protest, not with anger, but with silent, patient sorrow. They believed he didn't belong there. They believed something had gone terribly wrong. And yet, they followed the rules. No headlines, no public campaigns, just quiet perseverance, the kind that doesn't demand attention, only endurance. On the other side, Sarah's family also began a new chapter, one without her. They didn't speak to the press, they didn't celebrate the verdict, but they were there for it, Every day of the trial, they had been present, and when it ended, they returned to their lives the best they could, without their daughter, without answers, without peace. But with a final judgment they had waited years to hear, for them, justice had spoken. And yet, it hadn't filled the space Sarah left behind. Verdicts don't bring back laughter, or late night calls, or holidays. They don't undo birthdays missed. They don't reverse time. All they offer is a sentence, in a system that, for better or worse, moves on. The town, too, changed. People remembered, quietly, the house where Sarah died was eventually sold. New owners, new furniture, a new story being written inside those walls. But neighbors remembered the quiet of that night, the sirens, the sadness. Some avoided walking past the home. Others tried not to think about it at all. But the memory remained, soft, still, unsettling. Online, the case resurfaced from time to time. A documentary, a podcast, a discussion thread. People who had never heard the story before discovered it and asked the same questions all over again. Could he really have done it? Was there enough evidence? What if it had been an accident? New voices, same arguments, same uncertainties, and still no new answers. Living with a verdict means learning to carry what can't be changed, to find rhythm in days that feel unfamiliar. To accept that, for some, the story ended the moment the gavel fell, and for others, it never really did. Because some wounds don't close with time. Some doubts don't shrink. Some losses don't fade. They simply become part of the day, part of the silence, part of what it means to keep going. Ryan served his time quietly. No headlines, no statements, just years, marked not by events but by seasons, by routines, by the space between what was and what could have been. And for everyone else involved, family, friends, jurors, investigators, that time passed differently, but always with the same backdrop: a young woman, a bath, a call for help, and a decision that would define them all. Behind every verdict is a room, 12 people, one table, no cameras, no voices from the outside, only evidence, only memory, only the weight of responsibility. In the Widmer case, 3 juries were formed, 3 different groups of strangers brought together to decide the same question. What happened that night in the bathroom, and what did it mean? The first jury listened carefully. They heard the 911 call. They saw the photographs. They followed the arguments, both sides. They spent hours discussing what was presented in court. But something disrupted their process. Outside research brought in by a juror. Information not allowed in the courtroom. The rules were clear. Jurors could not seek outside opinions or use the internet. But someone did, and because of that, the verdict, guilty, was set aside. Not because of doubt, but because the rules had been broken and the process had to be redone. A second jury was called. Fresh eyes, new minds. They were told the details again, walked through the evidence, shown the photos, asked to decide. But this time, they couldn't agree. The arguments on both sides were strong. The evidence, complicated. The timelines, conflicting. They deliberated. They reviewed. And in the end, they said, "We can't decide." It was declared a mistrial. No verdict, no resolution. Just the weight of a question that still had no answer. Then came the third jury, the final group. Once again, the case was presented. The same evidence, the same call, the same night, retold from every angle. The prosecution emphasized the bruises, the dry floor, the timeline that didn't add up. The defense stressed Ryan's emotional state, Sarah's possible health conditions, the possibility of a tragic accident. Jurors took notes. They paid close attention. And when it was time to decide, they deliberated with care, for hours, for days. And when they returned, they gave their decision, guilty. But what goes through a juror's mind in those final hours, when they sit in a room with 11 others, holding lives in their hands? They are told to weigh only the evidence, not emotion, not media, not sympathy, only what they saw, what they heard, and what the law allowed. But even with those rules, it's never simple because evidence is filtered through human minds, and doubt, whether present or absent, lives in silence. Some jurors later spoke briefly. They said they believed the bruises couldn't be explained away, that the timeline felt off, that Ryan's behavior after the 911 call didn't seem urgent enough. They didn't say he was evil, they didn't say he had planned anything, but they believed something had happened, something that crossed the line from accident to crime. And for them, that belief was enough to convict. Others from the second trial never felt sure. They said there wasn't enough, that the story didn't feel complete, that every answer brought new confusion, and that kind of uncertainty made it impossible to decide. That's how mistrials happen, not from carelessness, but from conscience. Because when the law says beyond a reasonable doubt, jurors must carry that standard personally, not as a phrase, but as a weight. Being a juror isn't simple. It's not a role most people want. It means listening closely, separating sympathy from logic, and accepting that whatever decision you make, someone's life will change forever. And in this case, they knew that deeply. They had seen the family. They had watched Ryan. They had studied Sarah's photos. And they had felt the pressure, unspoken but real, of being the final voice in a divided story. In the end, the final jury decided. Their verdict stood, and Ryan Widmer's life would never be the same. But neither would theirs. Because once you've been asked to judge a life, that decision never fully leaves you. It becomes a part of your own memory, your own conscience, your own story. The headlines had faded, the cameras turned away, and yet the story didn't truly end. Because what was left behind, beyond the courtroom, beyond the news cycle, was a tangle of lives reshaped by loss, suspicion, and time. For the public, the Widmer case had been a headline, a mystery, a courtroom drama. But for those involved, it was something else entirely, a daily reality, an enduring grief, a truth that couldn't be explained in bold font or breaking news banners. Sarah Widmer was more than a name in an article. She was a daughter, a friend, someone who had just started her life. She had a smile people remembered, a future she never got to live. And for her loved ones, what mattered most wasn't what experts argued or reporters printed. It was that she was gone. No theory could change that. No verdict could fill that silence. And no timeline could erase the memories they still carried. Ryan Widmer became more than a defendant. To some, he was a husband who had suffered a tragedy. To others, a man who had been justly convicted. But inside the prison walls, he was simply an inmate, serving a life sentence, living in the aftermath of a night that still sparked questions. A night that had been examined, replayed, and dissected, but never fully understood. The headlines didn't show the quiet moments, the holidays missed, the letters read behind bars, the unspoken words at family gatherings. They didn't show the weight that each person carried long after the public had moved on. Because behind every courtroom case is something quieter, the slow movement of people trying to live again, trying to remember, trying to understand, trying to let go, without forgetting. In the years after the final verdict, the Widmer case became a reference, a story that law students read, a discussion point in journalism classes, a topic in true crime forums. But each time it was retold, something was lost, something intimate, something real. Because the heart of the story wasn't just about evidence, or trials, or legal outcomes. It was about people. Two lives that collided with an irreversible ending. No new facts emerged. No new trials were scheduled. The appeals ran their course. And still, there was no confession. No sudden reversal. No moment of revelation. Just silence. A long, slow stillness that replaced the noise of media attention. And in that stillness, people were left with what they believed, what they feared, what they hoped. For some, the Widmer case became a symbol of justice, of injustice, of the complicated spaces in between. For others, it faded into memory, a story that once captured their attention but no longer touched their lives. But for those closest to Sarah and Ryan, forgetting was never an option. The impact was permanent, the change irreversible. There were no books written by the families, no public statements, no memoirs, no documentaries approved by either side. Because some stories, when lived from the inside, aren't meant for retelling. They're meant to be carried quietly, felt deeply, and remembered without spectacle. The Widmer case left questions in its wake, not just about what happened, but about how we understand tragedy, how we seek truth in uncertainty, how we judge others, and how we live with what we may never fully know. In that way, it became more than a case. It became a mirror, reflecting the limits of knowledge, the depth of loss, and the enduring power of unanswered questions. The story of Ryan and Sarah Widmer never truly found its ending. There was a verdict, a sentence, a conclusion in the eyes of the law. But the people left behind, those who knew them, those who judged them, those who watched from a distance, carried away something more complex, something unfinished. Because even when a case is closed, the echoes remain. From the beginning, there had been questions, not just about facts or evidence, but about truth itself. What does it mean to know what happened? And what happens when the pieces never fit together? When the answers you're given still don't feel complete? For Sarah's loved ones, grief lived alongside those questions, every day, quietly. For Ryan's family, heartbreak took on a different shape, filled with belief, doubt, and silence. This was a story told in 3 trials, a story replayed in courtrooms and television screens, a story that drew people in because it felt close, a young couple, a home, a tragedy that seemed to happen without warning. And in that closeness, people saw reflections of their own lives, of love, of loss, of fear, of the things we trust to remain safe, and how quickly that can change. There were no confessions, no dramatic final scenes, no twist endings, just people trying to live with what happened, in a world that tried to understand something that may never be fully understood. The Widmer case is studied now, cited in law schools and forensic courses, discussed on podcasts and documentaries. It raised questions about jury instructions, expert testimony, and the limits of forensic science. But the people involved, those who lived it, aren't case studies. They are human beings with memories, with sorrow, with days that still begin and end with the same emptiness. Sarah's story ended that night in the bathroom, but her presence lived on, in photos, in family stories, in the quiet spaces where love once lived. Ryan's life didn't end, but it was transformed by decisions, by judgment, by a system that did its best to make sense of something senseless, and by time that continues without promise of clarity. What remains now is reflection, a story without winners, without full closure, only a lasting reminder that some truths, no matter how hard we search, remain out of reach. And that justice, when delivered, still leaves room for pain. As we reach the end of this story, we don't close it with certainty, only with care, for those who are lost, for those who are still living, and for the mystery that remains, resting quietly in the space between what is known and what will never be. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Not for the views, but because the more we remember these names, the less likely they are to be erased. Another case drops tomorrow. Until then, thanks for watching, stay safe, and take care of each other.